everyone, welcome back to The Modern Dentist, where today we have a very special guest. We have Jonathan from ZOE, who I will let fully introduce himself. But for those of you who don't know ZOE, which I'd be surprised if you don't, ZOE is the next generation of personalised nutrition and science behind the way that we eat. And this is something that I know that many of our listeners are very interested in learning more about, because their own health and well-being is important, as well as the health and well-being of their patients. So thank you so much for being with us, Jonathan.
It's a pleasure, Sonia.
So firstly, tell us a bit about you. Tell us a bit about ZOE for that very small part of our listener base that won't have heard of ZOE. What does ZOE do, and how did you come to co-found it?
I'm sure there's lots of people listening who have no idea who ZOE are, so I'm delighted to explain a little bit. So I'm Jonathan. I'm one of the founders of ZOE. I'm also the host of our ZOE Science and Nutrition podcast, which a few people, since this is a podcast, a few people may have listened to. And you know, I think Sonia did a great introduction. But what we're doing is we're trying to make personalized nutrition a reality, and we run the world's largest nutrition science study in order to give us the real data to allow us to explain what each of us should eat in order to improve our health. And I think the big realization that was part of what started ZOE was to realize that actually we're all really different. And that means there isn't just one answer about what we should eat, in just the same way that there often isn't one answer about what's the right medication for somebody with a particular disease, because we've started to realize that actually we respond differently in these cases. And so ZOE, we started, I guess, 5.5 years ago now, with my two co-founders, George, who I've worked with for many years, and Professor Tim Spector, who's one of the sort of top 100 most cited scientists in the world. So, very, very credible scientist, but also just incredibly nice guy, and really interested in how to, do this thing that scientists talk about, which is translation, which basically says, how do we go from all of this research, which is great and goes into these academic journals, but can often take 25 or 30 years to go from that research to something, real that a patient can get. And he was very excited, based upon all the research that he'd been doing on twins and on looking at the gut microbiome, about how could he actually translate that into something real that means that a listener could say, can I take advantage of that? Is there something that I can do at home to understand what I could do to change what I'm eating in order to address real health concerns, whether those are worries about what will happen as I get older and how do I manage to stay healthy and avoid dementia and diabetes, or whether it is I'm going through menopause and I'm having really, really tough symptoms, something people have tended not to talk about very much. What could I do about this? Or people who are suffering from, gut health issues, which is about a third of the population, probably a third of the people listening to this this call. And ZOE was created out of this.
It's an amazing story, I think, behind what you guys have built, and really disruptive. I think lots of people do now think more about their health and the way that they eat, but with no instruction manual. What are you supposed to believe out of the myriad fads and things that are out there? And I think what you said about making it evidence-based, I think is really resonating with people. It's certainly, when you think about the clinicians who listen to this, I think that is going to be really, really important for them, with their own health, but also for their patients. So you come from a background of founding companies and working in startups. How do you come to co-found ZOE? What's your journey been? Was it something that was?
It's a great question. I'm a sort of imposter. Why on earth? I'm surrounded by all these scientists at ZOE. How on earth did you get to do this? So my background, I originally studied physics quite a long time ago now, and basically went into technology after that, sort of series of internet related businesses, because that seemed like lots of fun. And I couldn't really figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I thought I was going to be a physicist when I started studying, and then I realized that I was going to do something that like 8 other people in the world understood. I was going to sit in this little room the whole time, and I don't really like sitting in a room all the time. I like talking to people, Sonia. Yeah. So I was like, I don't think that's going to work, and I want to do something that somehow feels like it matters to more than 8 other people. So I was a terrible scientist. I bailed on this. I went into technology, however, I had a personal experience actually while I was still at university, which in a sense is really the straight line through to ZOE. So I got very sick when I was about 22 with glandular fever. So mononucleosis for the Americans or the proper doctors on the call. And I was really quite unwell with it for about 6 months. And when I got better, suddenly I had all these food intolerances. And before that, I had the standard typical diet of like a 21-year-old student, which is pizza and hamburgers and kebab van at 2 a.m. after drinking too much, and never thought about this at all. And suddenly afterwards, I was eating this food and it was making me feel really sick. I was getting really upset stomachs, and it was like really unpleasant. And I went to see a bunch of doctors because actually I was pretty worried about this. And they did all these investigations because, of course, it could have meant that I'd had some sort of really serious disease. I might have had bowel cancer, right? I could have had IBD or something like this. And interestingly, the net of this, which was great news and why I'm still on this call right now, is I didn't have any of these things. And they basically said, you have irritable bowel syndrome, which is a sort of description doctors give to things when they don't really have like a good explanation of what this is, right? It's all the stuff that's like, we don't really have an explanation for it. And they said, it's probably been treated, and so you just adjust your diet, avoid all of this fiber and things like this that are causing you problems, and go away. And as a result of this, I suddenly started to think about what I eat a lot more than otherwise. And so that's like a big shift. And I think for a lot of people who think about food, there's some reason that they worry about it. It might be something like this. It might be a health scare, right? Where suddenly something happens to you that makes you think about it, or something happens to your family, or for a lot of people, maybe they're a bit older and suddenly they realize they could eat everything that that was fine, and now suddenly they see like they're putting on weight, and so these things change. So in this case, this was a big shock. So I started to think a lot about what I was eating because I was having these direct effects, and so I started to eat much more healthily. I took food more seriously, but I didn't get a good answer about like, well, sort of what should I eat? And the good news is that these symptoms sort of slowly got better over the next 15 years, and as I improved my my diet. But what's fascinating is that 5 years ago, when I had this done, not a single doctor talked about the gut microbiome, because actually nobody knew that these bacteria in your gut mattered. They knew that we had gut bacteria, right? People have known that for hundreds of years, but they were just sort of like irrelevant. And the reason why you would eat fiber is like, oh, you need to sort of bulk out your food, or like it'll help you with your water retention or something like this. And now we understand that we actually have trillions of bacteria in our gut. So like as many bacteria as we have cells in our body. And since I think you have quite a lot of dentists on the call, of course, there's also an enormous number of bacteria in our mouth. There's a whole separate oral microbiome, which is interesting. But most of the time when people are talking about the microbiome, they're talking about the gut, the lower intestine, because that is where there are thousands more bacteria than in the rest of your body put together. So this is almost like a big organ that your body has built in order to keep bacteria in it, right? And so that completely changes the way that you think about your body. And suddenly, Sonia, you are in fact not just this human being, you are this sort of fascinating combination of bacteria and human being. And that's the way that you were designed, right? When you were being built by your mother, like absolutely the expectation was you were going to get filled up with bacteria. But interestingly, you were born without any. And the very process of birth started, and your mother would have prepackaged assuming you had a vaginal birth, like pre-packaged bacteria to start that process. If you're breastfed, that would have also had this big impact on the bacteria that you end up with. And then through the rest of your life, particularly, I think we now understand in the first few years, your microbiome is being shaped because those bacteria play this very important role in not just your digestion, they're clearly very important in your digestion, but a really important role in your health. And we now understand that a very big part of your immune system is actually in your gut, managing these bacteria and helping to support the ones that break down this food, particularly things like fiber, so things that are in plants that are not too processed, and turn them into all sorts of chemicals that then cross through your gut wall, go into the rest of your body, and end up, through these through the bloodstream, just ending up in every cell in your body. And I think we used to think this was mainly about your metabolism, so you could see how this would affect things like your risks of heart disease or diabetes. But actually, there's been really interesting research in the last few years showing really strong links with things like mental health and mood as well. So it sounds crazy, but actually the bacteria inside your gut could be having a direct impact on whether or not you feel good when you wake up in the morning.
It's absolutely fascinating. And what you said about medics not being taught anything about the gut microbiome, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I graduated a long time ago, 15 years ago, and it just wasn't discussed. Like you say, why should you eat fiber? Well, it's sort of, to help you go to the toilet more easily, and it sort of stops bowel cancer, and that was it. And now what you're describing is something where, when you think about what you're eating, you're not just feeding your own cells, you're feeding this ecosystem of bacteria all around, including in your mouth, but also in your gut, that are really determining how you feel and how you function as an organism. So it starts to put a lot more weight on what you eat, and suddenly that kebab, it does more than...
Exactly. And I think, Sonia, it does really change the way you think about this, because, as you said, like if you're sort of an ecosystem, then you do suddenly think, well, am I eating the right food for your microbiome? I have kids, so this is how I explain it to my kids all the time, which is, well, are you eating the right food for your microbes? Because then it's a bit like if you have a pet, right? You've got to feed your dog the right food for a dog. We all know that a dog or a cat can't eat the same food as you. And similarly, there might be all of that food you really like to eat. But actually, if you start to realize, that maybe a lot of the advice that our mothers and our grandmothers gave us about, eating these vegetables and all the rest of it, well, there's a lot of sense in this. And the medical evidence is also incredibly strong. So, if you look at the all of these big long-term studies, interestingly, increasing your fiber intake is just about the biggest change you can make in terms of reducing all-cause mortality. But it's not something that people talk a lot about, because I think they had no understanding until very recently about why that might be the case. And, it's not as sexy as some of the other things. But I think now we start to understand just how important the microbiome is. I think we start to understand that we have done a lot of things over the last 50 years accidentally that have been quite harmful towards the sorts of microbiomes that we have, and that these things are probably linked to some of the crises we're facing with sort of non-infectious diseases in the UK and around the rest of the world. Whether that's diabetes, whether that's obesity. I suspect that this is also implicated in some of the mental health issues that we're facing. They aren't simply a product of COVID or breakdown of people living on their own or anything, but actually that the food and the microbiome is related. But I think what's exciting, because this could all sound very negative, is I think the other big thing that's come through really strongly in the research that we've been doing at ZOE is that we're not just a prisoner of our DNA. And so that means this isn't just this story about all this bad things going to happen to you, or like you didn't have the best microbiome when you were 3, so it's all over. Actually, by changing what you eat, you can have a really big impact on your health relatively quickly. And because we are unique and we have these different bacteria, if you can understand even better, like what's the right way to eat for yourself, you can maximize that impact. And so I think there's a lot of things that we've been discovering, which I think are true for everybody. We talk a lot about that on the podcast, about all these different things that we're learning. And the idea of ZOE is to sort of take that to the next level, to start with a test, which you do at home, which allows us to understand a lot more about you. So not just your microbiome, but your blood sugar responses to food, your blood fat responses to food, your diet, and then create the key thing, which is a program that says, okay, this is what you're eating at the moment. Let's help you to understand how we can make a series of changes towards something that's much better for you. And I think the thing that's most exciting about it, to be honest, is we've been seeing really great results. And I think the thing that's most surprising is how many people come back to us and say, you know what, I just feel more energy. So that was never something that we were focused on. It wasn't sort of the objective, which has really been about reducing inflammation and improving long-term health. But what's amazing is how many people following these diets for themselves actually just feel a difference in their energy within a month. And energy is not something I think that scientists understand very well, like that, like where does that come from, that perception? But I think it's pretty clear that the way we live our lives today, like a lot of us are fighting quite hard against the way that we would most naturally eat in a way that's going to make us feel good.
It's absolutely fascinating. And, you know, I think the bit that you said that hopefully will make people's ears prick up is there's something that you can do. This is not it's not all doom and gloom. There's something that we can do about it. So what is that? So maybe talk us through what actually happens when you work with ZOE. Is it, does it take years? Is it extensive tests? Am I going into hospital? What do I actually have to do to get an answer?
Absolutely. And, and I think, as I said, first thing I'd say is, if you aren't even ready for ZOE, then we publish a lot talking about things you can do with food that's available for everybody, because there's clearly a lot of things that I think we now understand, even at an average level, which are quite different from what people have understood. The way that ZOE works is we start with this at-home test kit. So that means that you don't need to go into hospital. You get a box that arrives at home, a rather beautiful yellow box now, which is rather better than our earlier versions as we were doing these science studies. And what that means is there's a sort of a period where you get to really understand how your body works. That includes using something called a blood sugar sensor or a continuous glucose monitor, which you just stick on your arm, a little like wearing an Apple Watch or something like this, but it actually measures what's going on inside your blood sugar every few minutes for up to 14 days, which for most people is an amazing insight into what's going on inside their body. And people discover, which they probably never thought about, that their body is having these huge responses to the food that they eat. And so, after most meals, you will see this sort of big spike in your blood sugar. And if you have good blood sugar control, you'll then see that comes down. But for a lot of people, they'll be like, oh, wow, that went much higher and it stayed much higher than they thought about. In certain cases, people will see they then get these big dips afterwards, which has a lot of impact on how hungry you feel and your energy. And we've actually published a few papers about this. We also get people to eat these special ZOE muffins that allow us to understand your responses to a sort of standardized meal that reflects really the standard British or American breakfast and lunch, and therefore we can compare you with now more than 50,000 other people eating exactly the same meal. And we can also understand what happens to your blood fats. And people don't talk about blood fats a lot, but a lot of people on this call will have heard of cholesterol, for example. And clearly, if more medically trained, will have heard of triglycerides and these other sorts of things. And it turns out that these are really as important as your blood sugars. They're also changing in your body, but at a slower period. And again, we can understand some people can eat really quite high fat meals, and it has almost no impact on their body. And other people can eat these, and still 6 to 8 hours later, you're seeing that fat in your blood. And if it can't be cleared, it starts to it commences this sort of quite negative spiral, which can lead ultimately to inflammation. It can lead to narrowing of your arteries and a sort of pathway towards stroke and other issues like this. So the reason why I'm saying this is, we all eat that same food, and what we see is this extraordinary variation in response. And once you start to see that variation in response, it starts to become obvious that we shouldn't all be eating in exactly the same way, right? Some people are having these great big blood sugar spikes. Other people are really struggling with their fat. So this idea that, everybody should eat, I don't know, a low carb diet or a low fat diet already, you can already see that that doesn't really make sense. And you can also start to understand why, there'll be many people listening to this saying, oh, my wife or my husband eats the same thing as me, and I have this completely different response. Or somebody told me, they absolutely swore that the best thing you could do is eat like this, and it seemed to work great for them, but didn't work for me. This is not just about willpower or anything like this. There are genuinely big differences between us. And so what ZOE then does after you've done this testing, which is really just to give us the data, then we start this program where we help you to understand how does your body work, and above all, what does that mean about the foods that you can eat? So we can give you a score for any meal. We can help you to understand, let's say, the breakfast you're eating right now, maybe it's not as good for you as you thought it was. Most people discover their breakfast, which they thought was brilliant, is a lot worse for them than they thought. Okay, how do I change that? And how do I understand step by step the ways that I can change my my diet in a way that supports my health? And critically, in a way that you can do this for years and decades. So we're not a diet. We're not interested in anything that's a quick fix. This has to be like, how can you live permanently in a way that's going to be healthier? And so that also means nothing is off limits. We don't believe there's any food is a poison, except actually poison, but most people don't recommend, eating poison. So nothing is a poison. If you want to have a cake from time to time, that's fine. You can have a cake. The question is more, how do I build like the overall diet that I'm having today or this week so that I can manage this? And actually, a lot of what people are doing is saying, you know what, I'd really like to have a bagel today. How can I construct a meal around that bagel where actually that meal is pretty good for me? And absolutely, you can achieve this. So a lot of this is about adding things into your diet. And you'll see for people who are really engaged in ZOE, they talk a lot about like the number of plants they're eating, because there's a lot of evidence that getting above 30 plants a week can have a real impact on your microbiome. It's a lot about adding foods that are really good for you. So a lot more healthy fats, for example. And I think what's exciting about that is I think it can create something that you can stick with. And, I think the other thing that really surprises people is we don't believe in calorie counting at all. We believe all the scientific evidence shows that for the vast majority of people, calorie counting doesn't work. And in fact, this is something that, we've been doing this mass experiment with over the last 50 years with a lot of support from the government and a lot of support from ultra-processed food manufacturers, which should also make you a bit suspicious. And we don't believe in it. Fundamentally, you need to move to a world where you're eating the food that's good for you and you're understanding your own cues about hunger and fullness. And if you can start to eat the right food, then you can deal with, I think, a lot of the underlying issues, which in most of our cases, I think, are tied to like this damage to your microbiome and this chronic inflammation, which again, I suspect some of these dentists on listening may recognize, because we just see this then sort of presenting in all aspects of people's health.
It's this piece around treating food as medicine itself and not having to take a whole bunch of supplements and medicating away your problems, and looking at the evidence and trying to basically find natural ways that you can address your, like you say, your gut microbiome. So what I think a lot of people struggle with when it comes to these things is, and the reason I asked about hospital visits and things like that is how accessible is that? Because if you've got all the money in the world and you're in a big city, you can go and see nutritionists and take time out of your day and buy loads of really expensive food and all the supplements, etc., etc. So I think the way that you're describing what ZOE does means that it's actually much more accessible, because what you're doing this from home, aren't you? This is on an app. This is not This is not something you have
Correct.
to, book in time out of your day to go and do. This is supposed to fit in your day as you would, do anything else.
Absolutely. So it's not free. So I don't want to pretend that this is yet accessible to everybody in the population. That is our aspiration. Like, we want to improve the health of millions. That's what we talk a lot about inside the company. And so ultimately, we hope that the NHS is going to end up paying for something like this. Today, you have to buy the test kit. You have to pay for the ongoing membership. This, I think, we consider today is very good value in terms of the way it can impact your health. And when you compare it against other things that you might choose to spend your money on, like a gym membership or something else, but it does have a cost. So I don't think we can pretend otherwise. And I think, like all technologies, these things start more expensive and they can become much cheaper as a number of people who are buying them increases, and so you can scale up, and so I think we feel good about that. I think in terms of the food, I think the other thing that people often worry about is, does this mean that I'm going to have to eat all of this incredibly expensive food, and I'm going to have to give up all these things that are really cheap? Actually, interestingly, it's really not true. And for a lot of people, one of the things that you'll see as a shift is that they're going to be eating probably less meat, a lot more plants. And interestingly, meat is the most expensive thing that you're going to put on your plate. And a lot of the foods that are incredibly healthy for you are surprisingly cheap. So, for example, there's a lot of people who are really shocked to discover that a lot of canned food is incredibly nutritious. And I think I certainly grew up with this idea that, like, it's sitting in a can, that's going to be like really terrible for you, right? It's sat there forever. Clearly some like fresh thing that you've just bought from the supermarket must be much better. But actually, both for canned food and frozen food, because this is actually packaged very, very quickly after the food is harvested, all those nutrients and everything else are getting locked in. And so, if you think about all these different varieties of tinned beans, for example, which I now eat a lot through my diet, they're incredibly cheap. Like, a lot of these things you can buy for like 50p for a can. That is going to fill you up. It's got an enormous amount of protein in it. Interestingly, it's got all of this complexity. This is not just about fiber. It's around this stuff called polyphenols, which are these complex chemicals that give different plants their colors and are also the sort of foods for these different bacteria that you want to have, right? So you don't want to just have one bacteria in your gut. You want to have all of this diversity. And that's incredibly cheap compared to the sort of ultra processed food that you can buy one aisle over. The challenge is around the understanding, right? Like, we have tended to grow up, particularly in like the UK and the US, in environments where we don't have a really strong cooking culture like you might have done in Italy or in India or something like this, where there's like this very strong sense about your own cuisine and how to cook a lot of things from scratch. We've moved from, it's been a long time that we've eaten very high amounts of very processed food, and actually the amount of food that is ultra processed in the UK and the US is more than half our diet now. So that means there is this challenge about like understanding, like, how can I start to make food for myself? And that is why sort of the program part of ZOE has become so important for people to understand, okay, what do I do to make these changes from what I've eaten before to what I eat now? And, I don't want to pretend there's no effort. There is effort, right? Whenever you want to make a change, there is some effort, right? You've got to think, and thinking is hard work. But I think the evidence now is looking really good in terms of the impact. And I think the thing that maybe coming right back to your first question about why did I do this and all the rest of it, is we have lots of members coming to us and saying, ZOE changed my life. And I have never had that before in my life. And I think that's pretty magical. And, my wife is a doctor. I know there's lots of dentists on this call. These are people in healthcare, probably used to this, right? Where you've done something really amazing for somebody and they come back and thank you. My background was really data science, internet. Yeah. That doesn't happen that often. So for me, I think that's quite magical. And on the other hand, I think it's also slightly terrifying. I think what we have done to ourselves in terms of the food culture that we've created, the way that we have, I think, with all the best possible intentions, moved to a world with this enormous application of antibiotics in cases that are not sort of life-threatening, where we've moved to such a sterile environment that we don't really interact with any of the microbes that are out there. And we're just trying to realize, well, hang on a minute, like we're also animals that have evolved for 1 billion years to be in this environment where we're coexisting with these microbes, right? There were microbes before there were multi-celled organisms, right? So we've been living with them for forever, for like billion years of evolution. And then just in the last sort of 100 or so years, we've suddenly said, oh, it's like a big experiment. I wonder if, Homo sapiens can grow up in this environment where we try and kill them all and separate them all. And the answer is we can live without them. You wouldn't die if you have no microbes, but it's clearly not very good for you, Sonia. And I think that we are just starting to realize that, out of all this great stuff like clean water and, hygiene and antibiotics, which I'm sure your dentists, apply a lot in their practice, there can be these real side effects. And we need to stop thinking about like all bacteria is bad and start to understand that, of course, there are some bad bacteria, there are some pathogens, but actually the vast majority is either harmless or even beneficial. And how do we start to live with it? In the same way we've all realized that we tried to give up anyone doing any exercise 100 years ago, right? Like our ancestors have been laboring for 10,000 years, and now, it's great, like we don't need to work anymore. And then we realize, everybody gets a heart attack and they get backache and nothing worse. Like actually you have to do physical exercise. And now we do stuff that our ancestors would have thought crazy, right? We go to a place called a gym and we lift heavy weights up and down. We pay someone to do that, and then we leave. Like, and so it'd be like, you're mad, right? But we understand now, actually, that is like this really important thing for our health and our mental health. And I think that this is the same thing. So to understand that we need to, if we're not eating the right sorts of food, if we're not living the right lifestyle, creating the right environment for our children, this can also have a big impact on health. And you can hear me get quite passionate because I think this is important.
And that's definitely something that I remember even talking to you the very first time. These pictures that you paint are really powerful, and storytelling around this, I think, is really important to give people the nudges and the motivation to do it. So for me, this picture of taking your gut microbiome to the gym really resonates. And the other thing that you said, I think that's quite easy to remember, because so often when people think about changing their diet, it's about removing things, and basically you're reducing it to the sort of the least amount of food and the least amount of variety that you can get away with to lose weight or whatever it might be. And there are ridiculous examples of this, like the grapefruit diet or the cabbage diet, that obviously are almost farcical. But most diets have an element of restriction. Having a diet that doesn't tell you to restrict things, but actually tells you to expand your repertoire and to look at 30 different fruits and vegetables a day is something that's quite easy to do in your mind. So every time you see something different, take a bit of this, take a bit of that. One thing that you said to me that really struck me last time we spoke was a fried egg, fried in olive oil, is healthier than an egg, a boiled egg by itself. And I think a lot of people think, well, but what about all the oil and there's sort of fats in there and that's extra calories? Why would I not just eat the kind of lean, plain egg? But your perspective was, well, look, think about all the health benefits in that olive oil, that you've now actually turned it into something truly nutritious rather than just a vehicle for as few calories as you can get away with.
I think that's right. Now, this does depend on the individual. There are individuals who are really struggling with fat, where actually you're increasing that total amount of fat. It could potentially be worse. But for the vast majority of people, that's right. And it is one of the things that really surprises them, that actually frying your egg in olive oil is probably better for you than a poached egg. And I think this is, again, it's just a great single example of how so much of the sort of food advice that we've been given over the last 50 years, sort of leading nutritional science researchers no longer believe. right? And so there was all of this advice, which I think so many of us still feel that like fat is bad for you. After all, it's called fat, right? So, if you don't want to get fat, then not eating fat sounds like a really good idea. It turns out that there is no correlation between eating fat and putting on weight, so putting fat on inside your body. So this is completely not true. And interestingly, there are foods, and I think extra virgin olive oil in particular is a great example of a food with some really fantastic health properties, because it is full of all of these polyphenols that I mentioned before, which are all these complex, actually defense chemicals that the plants have in order to protect themselves. And they turn out to have great health properties for us because they're this food for our microbes. And extra virgin olive oil is one of the foods that is richest in these polyphenols. And often it's these sort of bitter tastes that you get in plants. So if you think about a lot of berries, for example, berries like blackberries, which are very high in polyphenols, also have this bitter taste. If you think about the differences between like a lettuce that's like an iceberg lettuce that's all white, has no taste, right? It has no color. There's like nothing of nutritional value in that. And then you think about some of these salad leaves that are quite bitter, and colorful. That's the two together. These are the polyphenols. So the extra virgin olive oil, unlike some other sort of olive oil that isn't extra virgin, has preserved all of these polyphenols, and therefore there's a lot of positive health products. And so, just as you're saying, Sonia, like if you start to think about food as calories, the only thing that matters is like how many calories have you had. And so, frankly, you could have a Big Mac and cheese and a Coca-Cola, and if that's 800 calories, then that's going to be better for you than eating an avocado and olive oil and nuts that has taken you to 1200 calories. Now, as I say this, you're already like, that sounds really stupid, doesn't it? That can't really be true. And the answer is, of course, it's not. Calories are, I think, a very poor measure to think about what we're eating. And I think we increasingly understand that our food has this enormous complexity. We're also used to talking about just a few vitamins. So people talk about like vitamin C and vitamin D and calcium. There's some recent papers where they have now found tens and tens of thousands of chemicals that are in our food that we're therefore using. And those numbers are just exploding. So I'm sure it's hundreds of thousands, probably will end up being millions. And once you start to think about that, you realize, well, I need to eat quite a lot of different foods, don't I? If I want to get that breadth of complexity, and I've got to stop worrying about some individual vitamins, or every food has loads of things. So if someone says, oh, well, you need to eat a banana because it's got a potassium, like every food is stuffed with all sorts of complexity in it. So you've got to move away from thinking about these individual things and start to think about the total diet and start to think about how you're adding to it, as you said, rather than taking away, because a lot of people end up, just as you said, Sonia, with these very restrictive diets where, I've given up gluten, I've given up fats, and actually you're then eating something which is not good for you. Like you're really restricting the foods that you should be eating for your health, for your microbiome.
Fascinating. You're so passionate about this. It's so great to see and so inspiring. I think a lot of people just moving totally away from the nutrition side and more to the business side will be wondering, well, what's it like to run a company like ZOE? I mean, for those who don't know, it wasn't actually easy to get onto the ZOE program for a while because your waiting list was so long. And I know this because some of our team were on it, eventually managed to get on and had the experience. So you've generated so much enthusiasm and hype for what you guys are doing. The fact also, I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but the impact that you had on the way the country dealt with COVID as well, and the role that ZOE played in helping monitor that has just created so much buzz and enthusiasm. What's your life like as a co-founder trying to keep up with all of this while still fighting the good fight, I suppose?
Well, I mean, I think one of the funny things is I mainly just sit in my house, Sonia. So, one of the results when the pandemic happened, we all went home and started remote working. And one of the outcomes of the pandemic is we decided we're going to stay remote permanently, that it worked incredibly well, and we were able to hire all of these brilliant people all around the globe. And so actually, it's like, well, my little girl basically thinks I never leave the house. She goes to school. I'll come back home and wait for her, and then she'll come home and I'll be here. So in some senses, I never leave the house. I think that my wife's a doctor, and she runs her own clinic. And I think many of your listeners are probably running their own clinics, right? And so in many ways, I think that whether the business is a few hundred people as we are now, or whether it's 5, it's not very different. You're worrying about the same things. And in some ways, actually, the bigger it gets, the easier it is, because there's more people to help you out. I think the other thing that is similar is if you focus really hard on solving, what we consider our members, your listeners, maybe their patients' problems, like what are their goals? How can I really help them to get there? And if you stay focused on that, then you end up delivering something that's important for them. And I think the other thing, which is also similar, is for us, like we're really focused on the science. Like people who come to ZOE are people who believe in science, believe they want to get the very latest answers and evidence. They believe in, there's such a thing as truth, and that you can measure these things. And so if you don't believe in this, then probably we're not the right people. But I think the good news, despite sometimes what you sort of read in the press, is lots and lots of people believe this, which I find really, really warming. And lots of people want to take more control of their health. And I think that has been influenced by COVID. I think this was, it's a pretty shocking experience for everybody. It was very shocking for me. I found it very difficult, partly as a sort of mental health level of being locked in my house. And I think for many people, it made them realize that health wasn't just something that you worry about when you're really old and then the doctor comes and fixes. Actually, health really affects what you've done with yourself, because we saw that people who were in poorer health, if they had diabetes, or if they were much more overweight, all these things, their immune system was worse. This affected them worse. And I think it made a lot of people realize that looking after themselves now was really going to affect their quality of life. And so I think that's definitely had an impact. And in our case, I think also the fact that there were these amazing sort of 4.5 million people engaging with the ZOE COVID study also made them more aware of us. But I think that the biggest thing, I guess, today is this better realization that we have a lot of control over our health. Not complete, of course not, and things can happen, but actually by decisions that we make with our lifestyle, so particularly what we eat, but this is also the exercise we do, the sleep we take, the ways in which we live our lives, our mental health. These things really affect our long-term health. And I think a lot of people want to understand better what they could be doing. And I think, we touched on that earlier, this message that you're not just stuck with your genes, right? But that actually there's things that you can do now at any age, and where the results are quite fast. I think one of the things that's really striking is, people following this ZOE program at 3 months, most of those people, if they do follow it, are really feeling a difference. And so you can have an impact quite fast, particularly, if the diet that you're having at the moment is going to change quite a bit. Like, you can really feel that. So this is not sort of, I do all of this and in 10 years time, I hope that I don't get a heart attack. A lot of this is follow this and you can feel much better. And I guess the story I would, just put a personal story to pull that together. I broke 2 of my toes 3 weeks ago, which was incredibly stupid. I dropped a heavy bench on my toes, and I had to have some surgery. I won't go into the details, but like make them look more toe-like. And therefore, they gave me some really serious antibiotics, which I happily took, because you don't in fact want to get you're the doctor, but I understand you don't want to have some nasty infection in your bones. So I took these antibiotics, and what I'm aware was, like, I've spent the last 5 years working really hard to improve my microbiome, and it's really affected the way that I feel. And my response to this was actually really just to double down on trying to eat incredibly healthily over the last 3 weeks, because I know all the evidence that shows that the food you eat has a really profound impact on your immune system. And since I've got all this inflammation from this injury, actually, what I really want to do is have as little inflammation from the rest of my food as possible. And I also ate a lot of fermented foods to help to try and support my microbiome as it was being pummeled by these antibiotics. And so there's no randomized control trial, right? So I can't tell you what the difference is between this and if I hadn't done any of this. But I think it's made me feel good. It's made me feel that I have more control over what I'm doing. And it tells you that I certainly believe in my own medicine, so to speak. And I really do think that, the food that we eat, can have an impact on something like, sort of acute and short term like that, as well as, these sort of long-term lifestyle diseases.
It's actually a nice example. Yeah, you wouldn't think that breaking your toe actually has any bearing on what you eat, but that's a really nice way of thinking about it, that you put in all this hard work and you don't suddenly want it all to be for naught. So, so you talk a lot about, building this community of people who understand and believe this through everything that you're doing. I mean, you have your own podcast, like you say, you distribute knowledge freely and widely alongside everything that you do through the app. You also did something quite interesting, which I think is perhaps unusual in this field in terms of a recent crowdfunding initiative. Not something that is common in the sort of health and wellness and nutrition space. How did that go, and why did you do that?
It went incredibly well. So we did, and a crowdfund basically means like allowing all of our members to become owners in ZOE. And so we launched this campaign in December to offer the opportunity for everybody to, get even more engaged with ZOE and actually become owners, like the sort of big institutional investors who've been funding this so far, who are generally investing people's pension money. And it went great. We had more than 13,000 people participate. It was actually, I think the fourth largest crowdfund they'd ever had on the platform. But the thing that was most exciting, which it was the most women who'd ever participated in a crowdfund, and it was the most people aged over 65 who'd ever done this. And that's because basically these were people who were already strong supporters of ZOE, who and we know that just from all the all the messages they sent us, who were really excited, I think, to get more involved, feel more ownership, and be able to help to shape more the future, which is really the idea. We'd like to have these members more directly involved, because the whole idea of ZOE is we're doing all of this citizen science. We're continually trying to understand the complexities of food and lifestyle and how it affects our health, which means we rely on these thousands and even millions of people to participate, mainly out of the goodness of their hearts, Sonia, to contribute to something. Now, of course, they want to get this information back from themselves as well, and we want to share it back to them. But it is amazing. I think that ZOE has been driven a lot by the fact that people are not as selfish as I think sometimes everybody suggests. And as long as you're open and honest with them and you can give them something back for this as well, I think we've been amazed by the passion to sort of participate in this. And so this was a way to take that to the next level. It's worked really well in terms of this first time. Now we need to deliver in terms of creating more engagement, which is what we want to do this year, and create sort of an owners committee and think about how we can bring them in. And I think that's worked because there already was a lot of excitement about ZOE. So I think we couldn't have just launched this before anyone had heard of us, right? It works because people had heard. But I think it's a sign that a lot of people want to be engaged in the things that they're doing. A lot of stuff is sort of a bit done to us. If you think about how many people live in their lives on Instagram or TikTok, which are like these massive companies that are, in some other country with these algorithms, like you're sort of passenger, there it is, and you're a passenger and you're not at a scale you can understand. And so I think a lot of people want to have the opportunity to do something that feels good. And I think a lot of people want to work on improving themselves. I know that sounds a bit old fashioned, but actually, if I think about the podcast, I think the thing that has worked best about this is we try really hard to focus on actionable advice. So what are the things that you can actually do? And I think a lot of people are, interested in understanding, okay, what are the practical things I can do? Like I know every time I go to the dentist, I'm going to focus on like, what do I do to make sure that you don't do anything to my teeth, right? That's my objective, is that the dentist never ever does anything to my teeth. Like, what do I need to do? And I think that a lot of people feel that way. It's hard in our busy lives always to achieve this, and I think you've got to have that mindset. It's not about perfection. It's about like anything you do is a win. But I think that has helped to support it.
This is definitely a battle that most clinicians face daily, is trying to convince your patients to eat differently, and especially dentists. When you think about, the discussions that you have around sugar, if you can have something that is evidence-based and that is more than just, well, you shouldn't eat sweets, and actually talk about it more fundamentally in terms of your health and in terms of your gut, maybe that's a tool that our dentists can add to their arsenal of reasons why patients should take their diet more seriously, and therefore their oral health more seriously as well. Hopefully
I think that's really
useful.
No, I think that's really interesting. In general, if you think about what those sugary foods are, also, I suspect most dentists are not worried about people eating blueberries and blackberries, right? They're thinking about people eating these ultra processed foods, a lot of things which are sweets, and these are foods that tend to score extremely badly on ZOE, and that's because they tend to have really bad impacts on your blood sugar, so leading to these spikes and crashes. That affects, your risk of things like diabetes. It also affects your risk of obesity, but also it's doing nothing to support that microbiome you're looking for. And so, if we're thinking about children, for example, which is something that I think a lot about, because I think a lot about the diet. I have a 15-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I think a lot about this because we know how important like creating your health is at that point. I think there's nothing more important, in fact, than when you're kids. And the diet that we tend to give children is the worst diet. So actually, the kids tend to eat much worse diet than adults. If you go to a restaurant, they'll have this kids meal, which is like literally gray food without a plant inside, like no fiber. It's appalling. Doesn't exist. If you go to Italy or Spain or something, they don't have like this kids menu where you just eat junk. It's like, well, they'll just sort of eat the food like the rest of us. Yeah. And so I think that it's the same issue. This food that is so bad, it's not surprising, right? We've evolved for a long time. If we were meant to eat sweets all the time, then our teeth wouldn't all fall out, right? So the fact that that's happening tells you that you're eating this food that's really not well lined up with what we're used to eating. And I think the other thing that's interesting is there's a lot of evidence now around time restricted eating. So like, how often are you eating and the gaps between this? And that's both like long gaps from your last meal of the day to your first breakfast to give your gut time to recover. But also I think there's really interesting data as you start to look at what happens if you're eating all the time versus sort of having like a proper meal and rests and things like this. And so, it wouldn't surprise me that sort of the continual eating of sort of sugary sweets throughout the day is not only bad, it's not only bad for your teeth, it's clearly bad for your health. And so you're sort of having this this negative overlap. I think that we're very relaxed in general about foods that are like more whole foods that might contain sugar. So like there's a lot of fruit that scores really well for most people, for example, but you tend to eat that, as part of a meal at a particular point in time. And because it's all wrapped up generally like in this whole plant, actually the impact on your blood sugar tends to be much slower, doesn't release in that same instantaneous way. And I'm not a dentist, but I think in the same way, it's not like we evolved not to ever eat like sugary berries. That's clearly one of the things we love, right? So clearly it's what we want. But you weren't eating them, 10 an hour for 12 hours at a time. And so I think that is it is a great example of the way in which our diets are very different from what we would expect, and where this sort of ultra processed food is very different from the sort of food that we would naturally eat or that is really good for us.
So much in that, so much in that. And I think I've overheard one dentist once explain to a child that you can eat as much chocolate as you like, as long as it's in one sitting. From a dental health perspective, because it's that bathing your teeth in sugar that's the problem, and it's not just your teeth, it's your blood and it's everything else. So really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably not going to go for the all chocolate diet being good, particularly since most chocolate in this country, you wouldn't even be allowed to call it chocolate in any other country, because there's almost no chocolate in it. It's basically sugar and sort of milk products, not even whole milk, right? Like bits of it that's been extracted. But I think I would say that there is, like, the evidence is still quite early, and we've been doing quite a few of these studies around fasting at the moment because it's so interesting. But I was very skeptical about this a few years ago. It sounded like completely like crazy Californian sort of madness. But actually, I think we just did a big study in December where we had about 100,000 people try intermittent fasting, and a lot of people really felt the difference after just a couple of weeks. And this is basically where you're restricting the amount of time that you're eating to, for example, 8 or 10 hours or something like that. And so clearly you're restricting that food compared to many people, they start snacking at 7 and they're still eating at 11. And so you've got sort of 16 hours. And if you're potentially, having sweets almost all the way through that, you can see the massive difference in terms of the amount of time. So I do think that it's funny. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about impact on teeth, but there is no doubt that the byproduct of following the ZOE diet is, I don't eat the sort of sweets that I did used to eat in the past, and so the net impact on my on sugar on my mouth is definitely significant.
That's great. You say you're saving on your dental bills, which is excellent.
Absolutely.
Good. Listen, Jonathan, this has been absolutely fascinating. A super, super informative conversation, I think, for all of the clinicians listening and anyone else who's interested in the impact that food can have. And I think it would be strange if anyone walked away from this and didn't start to think more carefully about what they're eating. So I think this has been hugely, hugely impactful, I think, for all of our listeners. Thank you, Jonathan, for taking the time.
It was a pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you.
And where can people go if they want to find out more about ZOE?
So best thing is either just go to the website, which is joinzoe.com. So JOIN ZOE.com. And alternatively, since they're listening on our podcast, actually, if you just search ZOE Science and Nutrition, then if you subscribe there, I think you'll find this sort of ongoing train. And there's a lot of things that we've recorded, sort of talking more about just the latest scientific discoveries we've been making around food.
Fascinating. Well, we'll put all of these notes in the links as well. So thanks very much, Jonathan. Have an amazing day. We'll see you soon.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.